Greetings. My name is Brandon Clark. I'm the Division A uh, Graduate Student Committee co-chair of the Connect series. The Connect series is a sequence of live sessions broadcast on YouTube during the academic year. Each session features a different set of panelists and focus on a unique theme related to educational leadership, organization, and policy. Panelists include a combination of scholar practitioners, school and community leaders and policymakers, graduate students, educators, university faculty, and anyone else interested or encouraged to join these sessions. Today's session focuses on educational leadership and teacher support, and you're fortunate to be joined by three scholars in the field, and I'm going to pass it over and let them go ahead and introduce themselves. So who'd ever like to start, jump right in.
I don't mind starting. My name is Hans Klar. At the moment, I'm an associate professor at Clemson University. My career as an educator began in Maine. I actually worked at high school and middle school in Portland in the English language learning program, and really developed an affinity for that group of learners. And after I finished my undergraduate, I went to Japan for a couple of years and taught in a middle school there, and then kept going further afield and taught in Australia at a program for international students. We had a lot of students come from a variety of countries, and we would help them improve their academic skills, their English skills, and get culturally acclimated and placed in schools in Australia. And eventually I took on some leadership roles in that program, and then went to Shanghai, where we had a center, and I was involved then in more of a associate dean director of studies program, where we had 3 campuses, and we had a large number of staff, but very few of them had experience or had been on the second year of the contract. So my role very quickly became focused on developing other people as leaders who could take on responsibility and help me build the capacity of the organization. So that led me to my interest in getting a doctorate, and I did that at University of Wisconsin-Madison under Paul Bredesen, and I finished my doctorate in 2010, and then was able to come straight to Clemson. So I've been here ever since.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Dr. Salisbury, do you want to go next?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Salisbury. I'm currently an assistant professor at University of Illinois, Chicago. My education career kind of started off, I was a special education teacher in Chicago Public Schools for 7 years. And then I moved and taught in rural Wisconsin and then in Madison. While as a special education teacher, I kind of ran the gamut. I taught some self-contained when I first started. That was kind of the flavor of the field. And then began doing a lot more team teaching and actually doing some support with new teachers and how to understand and how to implement team teaching and different models of that. And that kind of led to some of my frustrations with the education system and how can we actually engage change in schools. And so pushed me to go back to graduate school. Same place as Dr. Clark. I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison and graduated in 2014. And then went to Iowa State University as a faculty member for 3 years, and am now, like I said, at University of Illinois, Chicago, and currently doing some work to understand how leaders are able to support teachers in engaging in culturally relevant practices in their classrooms. So,
thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Kristen Huggins, and I am an associate professor in educational leadership at Washington State. And my journey here actually started with both my parents are educators, and so then I became an educator. And I first started out as an English language arts teacher at my junior high alma mater. So that was my very first job, and then I taught in another junior high in my district, or the district where I grew up. And then I was a high school teacher in the high school where I graduated from. And eventually I decided to go and pursue my doctorate And that led me to Texas, where I was also working in schools the first year that I pursued my doctorate. And then I went to Texas A&M. I started being a graduate student. And in my roles in education as a practitioner, I was a teacher leader and those kinds of things, national board certified teacher, very involved in instructional change. And then when I became a doc student, I started focusing on some work in Dallas ISD. So I worked in a STEM center, and we did instructional implementation of STEM work in Dallas ISD. And so then I graduated, and now I'm at Washington State. And my work focuses on instructional improvement in under-resourced contexts.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for being here. So I'm very excited for this session. I think the viewers are going to be very interested to hear the discussion that we have. So I'm just going to kind of start off with the first question that I have posed, and that's, how can educational leaders support teachers in promoting social justice in their classrooms? And so I'll leave that whoever would like to take a stab at it first.
I don't mind going first. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say, though as they stated, they have a lot of experience in this area. Firstly, I guess I would say in our program, we don't often use the term social justice, and I think it's important to be clear about what you mean about that. So we usually think about it in terms of promoting equity and opportunity for all students. We find that's a very very easy way to latch on to this area and have conversations with people. And so I think for me, as I think about how educational leaders can support teachers in promoting social justice or equity and opportunity, I think about what's the long-term impact of that? What is it that you really want teachers to be doing to this end? And I think for me, it's really about creating an environment where all students feel safe, they feel welcomed and part of the learning community, where they recognize that the same expectations are being held for all of them, that teachers are focusing on the assets that they bring to the classroom rather than focusing on some of the disadvantages they may have had along the way. And really, to that end, in a lot of taking opportunities to differentiate their instruction, whether it be the content or the activities the students are involved with or how they're assessed. I think providing opportunities for students to work interdependently so that they encourage positive interaction and develop understanding and familiarity. So then I think if you step back and apply the same logic to how leaders can support teachers, you think about the myriad of ways teachers leaders influence teachers as a school and the school as a whole. And so, and since we know that they do, and they do that in a variety of ways, I think it's important to really think about taking a holistic approach to creating a school that promotes equity and opportunity. So not just focusing on what happens in the classroom, but looking at it more systemically. So I think if you want to take that approach, then really think about what can the principal do through modeling, through demonstrating what they see as important by what they focus their attention on, what their discussions are about, what questions they ask. You know, are they the ones raising questions about the makeup of AP versus remedial classes? Are they the ones who are raising questions about which students are always being sent to the office or who's always getting up on stage on awards day? They can really take the lead in asking those sorts of questions. I think also the way principals talk about students, the way they talk about constituents in the community, do they think about them in terms of the deficits that they bring to the school, or more in terms of quite simply what do we need to do to support these students? And then I think getting closer to the classroom, looking at how school leaders can use the systems that are in place, like observations, walkthroughs, formal and informal conversations and evaluations, as a way to keep reinforcing these issues. In what ways is equity being promoted and reinforced in the classroom? I think other sort of concrete things are thinking carefully about which mentors new teachers get assigned to. Are they ones that are going to help them develop a mindset of promoting equity? The way they arrange teams, assign new classes, determine the focus of professional development, what they decide to use meeting time for. All of these ways, I think they can use to be promoting this and putting it on everybody's radar in a systemic way.
I would, so I'd build on some of the things that Hans mentioned. So I think kind of within the field, social justice is, it's becoming a really catchy term, or has become a really catchy term, but that's resulted in it meaning a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so I think one of the first things you have to do to support teachers in engaging in socially just practices in your school is to have some honest conversations in your school community about what does social justice mean to us, and how are we defining that, and what does that mean for our practice. And so ideally, you're going to have a really broad definition of that in terms of it means things like engaging in anti-racist practices, right? But it also means supporting students who identify as LGBTQ, supporting students who are receiving special education services, whatever it might be. But I think developing that common definition is really important. And then thinking about how do we embed that definition throughout what we're doing, so that it doesn't just become an add-on. So what I mean by that is it has to be embedded in the actual instructional practices that teachers are engaging in. We can't claim to be a school that's grounded in social justice, but then still teach the same way that we've always taught, that we know that exact way of instruction has served to marginalize populations historically. So we have to think about what are the teaching strategies that teachers are using, but also what's the content that we're engaging students around, and how are we assessing that? If we're not engaged in all of those things kind of completely, then things are going to fall off the table really quickly. In terms of how to support teachers in that work, I think you have to take a shared growth perspective, so that we have to deprivatize practice, and everybody has to engage in this collectively. So if teachers aren't engaged in conversations as teams and working together, and you as the leader embedding yourself into those teams, either as yourself or through distributing out leadership to instructional coaches, or developing artifacts that support teachers and having those conversations, you're going to end up with kind of like pockets of equitable practice, like spread across deserts of inequity in your school. And so that becomes really problematic. And so also to do this, it's asking teachers to teach in a new way. I'm focusing, I guess, the question really down into that classroom level. And so you have to create a safe space for, if you're doing those walkthroughs and you're doing kind of not even evaluations, but you're doing assessments of teaching, teachers have to feel willing to take that risk. They have to know that if someone comes in to observe them, that's a growth experience. It's not a, we're gonna ding you on this, and we're gonna have conversations, and we're all gonna grow collectively from that. The other piece I think that you can't not talk about when engaging this conversation is the current standards movement. In many ways is pulling us away from being able to do this in schools. In large part because the standards are becoming the substitute for the curriculum in a lot of schools. And so we focus on that as the curriculum, as opposed to developing a curriculum that is culturally relevant or culturally sustaining for students, and then mapping the standards back onto that curriculum. We go the opposite way. And then in developing that culturally relevant curriculum, that's where community engagement becomes really important to create opportunities for teachers to engage with the community and the community to engage with teachers around what are students learning, why are they learning it, what does the community think students should learn, and why do they think that? I think we don't always do that. We don't think of, we maybe have, back to school nights or this or that, but we don't create conversations between teachers and community members about how to structure classrooms to be more supportive of the students who are there. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm going to be adding a little bit, but I also think I'm going to be reiterating some of the things my colleagues have said. But I think the question, how can educational leaders support teachers in promoting social justice in classrooms? I think the first place they have to start is being critically conscious of where they are concerning social justice and what their story is, and where they are developmentally, and even being able to practice that. And so, because it's hard to support other people in doing something that you struggle to do on your own. And so I think that and then those leaders have to have professional development provided for them and support to do their work to support teachers in enacting social justice practice. So I do think you have to come to some shared understandings. Definitional terms are helpful, but definitely some shared understanding. So if we think about the educational leadership literature, it's knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and you have to have a disposition towards equity. And that's kind of the lens in which you see your work. And then you have those practical pieces of how we're going to do practice based upon that. And then when people are concerned about things like standards and that kind of thing, you continuously show how alignment is occurring because of those practices. And so I really think that, and you constantly have to be critically conscious because we're systematized in a way in which inequity is structured, right? And so unless you're you never arrive on the equity continuum, just like you never really arrive on the instructional improvement continuum. And so I think that it's constantly being critically conscious of where you are in your understanding of equity and your practice of equity. And then it's also seeing the ways in which you're getting systematized, because language is given to us from our states and from the federal government, and those things frame the ways in which we talk about things. And so even, in the interactions we have with language, then we pick up words and we pick up frames without even critiquing them. And I think that that's really important. And I think just helping teachers be aware of not accepting every frame that's given to them by those entities is really important, because then it frames the way they think about it. And so, but to go back to what Hans and Jason have said, just really asking those questions, talking about how it's going to happen, what are the things are going to be the look-fors, how do we see this in classroom practice, how do we continue down that journey together, and continuously tether back to those definitional terms and those shared understandings.
I want to just reiterate, Kristen, that Hans and I totally skipped that, but the personal reflection amongst yourself as a leader, you can't engage with teachers around this work if you haven't engaged with it yourself. And also beyond the reflection, even begun to think about and learn about the type of instructional strategies you want your teachers to be using. You yourself you don't have to be an expert in them necessarily, but you need knowledge of those type of things. You can't support people in engaging in something that you yourself aren't ready to do. So thank you for mentioning that.
I think so. What I think I'm hearing is a big part. First of all, sounding like the need to have a common understanding of what it means to be socially just in school, what social justice looks like in schools, and what that definition looks like. The other things I'm hearing a lot of is about the systemic, the need to address the systemic nature of issues in school, rather than a lot of times we hear about, well, let's do professional development, let's do more training, let's do different things. But at the end of the day, it's about reorienting the organization or the institution. Is that kind of what I'm hearing about my own that in some regard?
Yeah.
So then what I'm thinking too, I'm hearing about becoming critically conscious. And this is going to take us to kind of another question is within principal with leadership preparation programs, and thinking about the connections. So what we kind of are prepared to do and then what we enact in schools. How can preparation programs perhaps better prepare future leaders to just support teachers? Talking about being able to have that critical consciousness of yourself. But a lot of times there aren't requirements to be critically conscious, right? There's not. And so I think as a systemic approach, looking at preparation programs, how does that tie into actually working and being, in the profession, in schools, working as a leader? What can maybe prep programs do to better prepare teachers or teacher leaders, principals?
I can go first. I think there's a couple things that come to mind. I think a lot of the leadership programs that I'm familiar with, there isn't a huge grounding in thinking about adult learning. And so thinking about how do we support teachers and any adult in our school, but how do we engage adults in learning? We maybe have like one class on professional development or one class on instructional leadership, right? But we don't dig into that idea of like adults and students don't learn the same, they learn differently. And so how do we do that? How do we support adults in learning toward a common goal? And how do we support not just individuals? We have to think about supporting individuals, but we also have to think about supporting teams of teachers and then your whole staff. And so how do we think about support in those three ways in schools, and identifying like which group of teachers form a team that we need to support in their growth? Because it might not be like your English department or your third grade team. It might be you have like teachers across your school who need growth in this area. So how do you identify that group of teachers and then create a space to support them and then support this other group of teachers in their other learning need? So for me, the biggest way I think would be to think through the adult learning. And then also I think that leadership prep programs, we are schools of education or colleges of education, depending on the institution, they're really siloed. So like there's very little conversation between leadership programs and like C&I programs about like what's the current understanding of teaching. And so I know like, so I graduated undergrad in 2000. So my understanding of like best practices in teaching in some ways is grounded in what I learned as an undergrad. But like the field has changed. The field has like really, really shifted from that. And so if I'm not actively going out and trying to figure out what that is, then I can't support leaders in being able to support teachers, because they need to know what first year teachers are entering into their school and knowing, but they also need to know what like a 25-year teacher, 25-year vet teacher needs to learn to kind of be up to speed in what current best practices are in the field. And so like I'm teaching an instructional leadership course, and so it's around literacy. And so I've gone around to all of the literacy faculty in the School of Education at UIC to say like, help me understand what current knowledge tells us about teaching literacy in schools, so that I can infuse some of that into the class, so that then the students in the class can go and do that when they're principals.
Right.
I'm going to go off of that a little bit, because in some of the research that I've done, and when we've studied educational leaders, principals specifically, many of them will say something like good instruction is good instruction. And none of my teaching and learning colleagues would ever say that. They would say good mathematics instruction is good mathematics instruction. They separate it. It's, the term is pedagogical content knowledge, but that pedagogy is very much tied to content, and it's differentiated between disciplines. And so for an educational leader to say that there's just this coverall with good instruction, is very problematic to getting deep and meeting where the practices are with teaching and learning today. And so I guess I just want to reiterate that we do need to be tighter with teaching and learning and where their field is moving in order to support teachers in doing their work. But I also, I am kind of reiterating what Jason said as well, but the added piece about adult learning is accepting where adults are developmentally. Many times we have students come into our programs that are going to be educational leaders that are pretty advanced and driven and those kinds, but that's not every adult. And I just think that I've seen a lot of struggle with people accepting adults where they are developmentally and wanting to take them somewhere else. So they want them to be somebody else instead of growing the person that's in front of them. And the key differential in adult learning is experience, and people come with mental models, and accepting that as well, and seeing those as actually a benefit, an asset instead of a roadblock.
Yeah, I think in addition to the things they said, I think there are there's research in our field as well that we can apply. Shapiro and Stefkovich have done work on multiple ethical paradigms, ethic of care, the profession, justice, critique. So using frameworks like that and helping students think through challenges using frameworks like that. You know, in our own professional standards, we have a standard on equity and cultural responsiveness. So these are embedded in the things that we should be doing. At the same time, we should also be looking interdisciplinary to see what else we can apply. And, you know, I think another thing is we're a very applied field. So in our classrooms, there are a lot of opportunities for us to not only be modeling the creation of safe spaces to have difficult conversations and how you develop the trust amongst a group of people so you can get to that place, but we can be using these types of frameworks and through assignments and through class discussions, provide opportunities for people to begin to critically reflect and to sort of check their own pre-existing beliefs and possible biases and any sort of competing commitments they have to seeing an equitable culture be developed in their school. So I think those are other opportunities for us to, in a very pragmatic way, to make sure we build this into our program.
So kind of going off of that then, and it kind of ties into this too. So what do then educational leaders need to support teachers? So I know like, and maybe not only in preparation, but also in school districts, what do they need from superintendents? What do they need from, you know, other constituents or even teachers themselves to support teachers? And then kind of what are maybe some of the barriers that, or I guess well, first, what do they need to support teachers? And then we'll kind of move on to that other part. But
well, I think we talked a little bit about what they need to do to support teachers. I think if we think about what they need to be able to do that, in some of the research Kristen and I have done on leaders who develop other leaders, one of the things we've clearly seen is they need the support of people at the district office, and we've heard the phrase, they have my back. So if school leaders are willing to try to start moving the needle in terms of developing a more equitable school environment, they're going to start ruffling a lot of feathers as people have to start changing practices and rethink the way they do things. So they're going to need to know that the district leaders have their back. And I think modeling again comes to play. Again, we can't ask people to do things that they're not seeing demonstrated in other places. And you know, Sally Zebeda and some of her colleagues in Georgia did a study recently on professional learning of principals in a number of districts. And they found a lot of common practices and things we might not be surprised to see. You know, the aligned content that's very focused on the career development, it's personalized, ongoing, job embedded. But one of the interesting things they found was that it was rarely self-directed. which I think has very clear implications for the district's role in taking a lead here and supporting principals, and not only supporting them by sending them off to a training course, but making sure that there is follow-up opportunity that's more job embedded and continuous, like, you know, making sure they have critical friends, that they have a community of practice, or that maybe they're part of a networked improvement community where they can continually talk about the challenges they're having in moving their faculty along this continuum, and moving along it themselves, perhaps. So I think those are some critical things that they're going to need for support.
Yeah, and I'll just go off of that. We have a district in our area that's doing a lot of personalized learning. And I think this is occurring nationally. And I think that principals need some personalized learning as well. And so how does that, again, it goes back to if a principal is not critically conscious, it's hard for him to lead somebody else down that path. If a principal is not getting personalized learning, it's hard for him to provide that for his faculty, or his faculty to provide that for students. And so I think that it's really important to see those connections. I also think that, you know, physical resources are helpful. I mean, they always are, but also helping people see how they could utilize resources differently, or possibly getting some freedom in hiring practices, or the ways in which they are able to do other kinds of leadership work. So not just, I guess I'm tethering out what support might look like. So beyond just the fiscal piece of providing a budget line or something like that.
I would build on all of that. I think leaders need time, and I think we can think of time in two ways. So they need like time during their day to engage in the work of supporting teachers. And some of that is time when students are in school, and some of that is time when students are not in school to you know, engage in some sort of professional learning opportunities. But also leaders need time in terms of like sustained time to engage the change process in their school and support teachers. So we can't expect that a principal is going to make X, Y, and Z changes in 6 months. We have to say that schools are big ships, that it takes time to change what's happening in a school. It takes time to change the culture of a school in a deep way. So leaders need that time. You know, so district level leaders or superintendent or school boards or whatever you might have, they need to know that. They need to say, okay, if we don't want you to go for kind of like the cheating the system or gaming the system approach, then we have to give you the time to be able to do that. We have to recognize it's going to take more than 6 months. It's going to take a couple of years to get where you're going. You provide us clear ways that you're going to know you're moving in that direction, though, as the building principal. I also think principals need good feedback on their personal performance. It's something that we struggle with. I've done some research on the comprehensive assessment of leadership for learning, the call. You have VALAD that came out of Vanderbilt, but we're notoriously bad at like providing leaders feedback on their work and like formative feedback on how they could get better at it. And it's really hard to grow in what you're doing if you're not getting feedback on how you're doing in that. And then building on things I already said, I think we need mentorship. Principals don't get a lot of mentorship, or they get really superficial kind of your first year. But, you know, now in Chicago, it's a little bit easier because Chicago is a really large place. So there's a lot of mentorship available. But if you go into parts of maybe rural Washington or rural South Carolina, like it's harder to find mentorship for principals because there's not a lot of them around that maybe are in the same position. And so how do we develop mentorship networks? And then principals need ongoing learning opportunities. How do we support the ongoing learning of a principal just like we do for a teacher?
And before we leave this question, I just want to come back to Jason's comment about Washington and South Carolina. I mean, one of the things that's clear in Hans and I's research is just that, you know, principals get differentiated opportunities based upon context. And I think that we have to, you know, we're generalizing what do educational leaders do, but that's not, these things don't happen without some contextual variable. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, in fact, we have seen, we've done a lot of work with a consortium of 12 school districts that's predominantly rural and high needs. And they have done a really good job over the years working together in terms of sharing professional development resources and other trainings, and really trying to take benefit from doing things at scale across the districts. And that included, in the work we were doing recently, a leadership learning community where experienced school leaders from some districts would go to work with less experienced leaders in other districts. So we had a cross-district pattern of support. And so I think that shows that, as Kristen noted, districts do need to be creative in terms of how they can get their support. And, you know, it's more challenging in some places than others, but they just have to be more creative and maybe look for partnerships with universities or other districts or foundations to make that happen.
Excellent. Probably this next part of kind of the question was what, and you've all touched on this a little bit, kind of, I think, in asking what educational leaders need to support teachers, but then kind of looking at the barriers. Now, Dr. Salisbury, you mentioned time, how leaders need time. And kind of my question is, so as not having time would be a barrier. Talked about the standards movement, high stakes evaluations and testing, and what are some maybe other barriers, or how do those barriers work against educational leaders within school contexts and even across contexts? So you mentioned rural schools, and then how can these barriers be mitigated? We're limited. Schools and principals are limited with their time, resources, and even also perhaps preparation and professional development. But I'm assuming there has to be ways that these things can be overcome to fulfill the goals in supporting teachers in classrooms.
Yeah, I think that time is the first thing that comes to mind. And I think time, again, like Jason said, in at least two different ways, that time during the day with the myriad distractions that principals are confronted with, but the tyranny of now and having accounting for change now. And whereas we know that professional learning takes time, changing practices takes time. So we have to have that sort of support. We don't always necessarily have the time, or at least people don't have the patience to give you the time in that space. I think there's all the usual resistance to change. And if you have people or institutions that are particularly resistant to change, that's going to require a more focused effort. And again, that takes your attention away from other things. So you have to be weighing this up all the time. Clearly, trust is a huge moderator in what you can do in a school. So investing in that, I think, so that kind of begs to the idea of having a plan and being a little bit strategic and hastening slowly, so that you can be somewhat strategic about developing relationships and trust in people before they're willing to listen to your challenges of their practices. You know, some things need to be challenged immediately, no doubt, but I think in other cases where you can be strategic and build up a trusting environment, you'll probably have a greater return on your investment. I think some of the things that, you know, and of course then there's the larger political and socio-cultural context. I mean, I visited a school recently where over 50% of the students were from a variety of Central American countries. And the whole community is terrified of what's going to happen to them, their family members and things. So that's a very difficult environment to teach children in, and that's part of the context. So I think in those cases, to mitigate some of these barriers, you need to develop a lot of familiarity with the people that you're with, the different constituencies, and you need to be supported and having time to go out and meet with those groups and work with them. I think students' voices are very powerful to teachers at all times. And so hearing things from students' perspectives and community members' perspectives, really making sure those voices get heard can be a very powerful catalyst for change. Yeah, and I think working with other leaders in the school, I mean, we've talked about, we have an inordinate amount of responsibility heaped on the role of the principal, but we know there are a lot of other leaders in the school and they don't all have formal roles. So who else in the school can principals be working with to develop initiatives and to support their colleagues? So creating opportunities for teachers to observe other teachers who perhaps have better classroom practices in terms of equity and providing opportunities. And looking for those sorts of opportunities, I think, is a key approach here to mitigating the challenges.
I'll build on Hans listed a good list of the barriers that exist. I'm going to dig into one, and that's this idea. It's related to kind of political climate, but also the external demands that are put on schools. And so some of those come from the state, some of those come from the federal government, some of those might come from the local district, depending. But that can quickly become a barrier. But there's also, I think Mike Knapp has done some work on the way that leaders are able to kind of leverage external kind of accountability demands and other pressures into shifting their school cultures. And so I think, I don't mean to say I'm not dismissing barriers, but I'm saying I think it's important to say these are the real barriers, and now, like, how can we fruitfully respond to them in a way that can move us in a direction forward. I know, I remember being a teacher when, like, No Child Left Behind first came out, and there were schools that were fighting it and fighting it and fighting it. And some of that fighting was for good reason, obviously. But there are other schools who were like, we're going to pick this up and we're going to use it, and we're going to use the parts of it that make sense for us, and we're going to pay less attention to the other parts. So, like, that disaggregated data piece, we're going to go with that because that's going to allow me to advance my equity agenda in the school. The standards movement, you have some principals who have said, I can take Common Core, and that's a way to deprivatize practice. It's a way to get teachers to talk about what they're doing in their classroom. And so I might have concerns about it, but I'm going to use it in a controlled way in my school to get us to a place that we might want to go. And so I think when we're thinking of barriers, we have to think about that. What are the ones that that we can build on, and how can we leverage those in our schools? And then what are the ones that we just have to buffer teachers from? The other thing I'd say about that is I'm starting to do some work here in Chicago with Shelby Kosner, another professor, to understand the role of principals as activists in the community. And so how are they pushing back against some of these barriers through their work in the community? And so I think that's part of the way to respond to barriers, is to also think of how can I go outside of the school to maybe mitigate or minimize some of these barriers by tapping into community resources and maybe pushing and pulling on levers out in the community in different ways. So.
Yeah, I'll just go off Jason. I mean, I think it's also teaching people to be courageous when barriers come. And as far as when something comes and there's just general pushback from people, I think, you also have to call out people's professionalism. I mean, there's reasons people came into education, and I think that that's important to circle back around to. And so I do think that that's really important. I also think that you have to have honest conversations about we need to continuously have and build capacity, whether that's technology. Recently in our state, school shootings and the notion of care. I mean, we're going to need more capacity. The time will come, and whether that's around achievement, whatever. And so, how are you continuously thinking about building your capacity to and increasing it in every single person in your school? And so, I just think that that's really important because we'll always need more capacity to do the work, whatever the work is. But I also think with the the challenges, the support has got to equal the pressure and how people interpret the pressure. I think of after Common Core, the various schools across our county and the ways in which they differentiated their impression of Common Core. Some were super, yay, let's go. And some were like, oh my, and so I think it's also people's perception of things. And then how do you measure that and how their interpretation of that pressure and their resiliency to address that pressure. And so, and then that goes back, I guess, to our previous conversation, accepting adults where they are and what they need to learn, right? So, and how you can support them in moving forward.
Excellent. Excellent. I think I just want to kind of just transition just a little bit. So we've been talking, I guess, about what, from the practitioner side of things, how can they deal with barriers? How they can, try to mitigate some of the challenges. But what research do you think is still needed? I mean, there's a lot of research that's always going to be needed. But what are some directions for, future researchers or people in, myself and in graduate programs, and how can research inform practice? So what are we needing in these areas, academia?
Well, I think, one of the things Jason was saying, he's doing some research on how and to the extent that principals can be activists for students. And I have a student at the moment who's also doing research in this area to find out how politically engaged principals are in the state. The thinking being that if they're more engaged in the development of policy, policies are more likely to be better developed. And if people have had a role in developing them, more likely to be implemented and more applicable. And so I think there's an area in that regard. I think in the field and in the standards we have or had a focus on principals as advocates, but I don't know that it was ever really all that well developed. We sort of acknowledge there's a lot they have going on in the schools. If they can be an advocate within the building, they're doing a lot. But I think that's an area we need to start thinking more about.
I think in terms of research that's needed, so that's a really difficult or challenging question, because I can be like, oh, the areas that I'm researching, so I think clearly we need more research in that area. But that's just like, that's me being, clearly there's a need there because that's what I do. And so I don't think that that's the best way to look at it. I think maybe the best way to look at it is to go to your second question of how does research inform practice? And even to flip that and say, so how does practice inform research? So how do we as a field spend time out in schools and in not just schools, but the communities in which schools are situated, right? We always talk about classrooms are nested in schools, but schools are also nested into a community. So how much time are we spending out there talking to people and seeing what's going on, to understand that this is what the field needs right now, and that's a way to make sure that our research is responding to those needs. I bet that both Kristen and Hans had this same type of thing where you do your dissertation as a doctoral student, and there's some random finding that bubbled to the surface in your dissertation that you never thought about, and then that ends up being an idea that you end up chasing. Like for me, it was the role of students as leaders in schools, and like leaders beyond like being on student council. It was like students engaging in leadership that the school didn't even realize that they were engaged in. That like students were like doing all kinds of mentoring and counseling for each other, and the school doesn't recognize that work. And so this whole thing, and it was just because I talked to some students that I saw that, and then it started to keep coming up in my data. And so if we're out in schools and we're really looking at what's happening, we'll begin to understand the research that's needed.
Right.
I think it's problematic to say, I want to go study this because I know I can get the IRB, I know I can get the participants, I know I can get all of these things in line, so I can go study it. And then I'll figure out how to connect it to the field in that little implication section of my article on it. So.
Yeah, I just want to go off of that a little bit about the research that needed. I mean, I think there are some areas we do need to get tighter with teaching and learning. There's definitely a gap there. And the separation and the academy is actually structured so that we don't talk to each other as much because often we're not in the same departments. And so I think that is definitely an area of how we get tighter. Actually, you know, I think evolutionarily and historically standards, and then No Child Left Behind, and then ESS, I think we're right for that. Especially with Common Core and all those kinds of things. But I also think, you know, we're at a pretty nascent stage in understanding how we prepare leaders to do a lot of things empirically. We're only on our second handbook of leadership education, and I think that we need some more work there for sure. And those aren't my only research areas or super close to my research area. So I just am thinking of the field generally. But I also think that, I mean, this panel's we all know each other, but we all deeply care about schools, not just research, and the practices that occur there. And so, and then we see this national movement where IES, the research arm of the Department of Ed, as well as the Spencer Foundation, are now providing funding for research practice partnerships because they realize that research is never going to be a part of schooling if we don't have these partnerships, and that's what the consortium was about, and Hans can talk more about that, but that's really the work that we deeply want. But that work takes time for researchers as well, and so really, how do you marry? And it's continuously figuring out how to engage researchers with practice and practice with research. And I think that we need more understanding of how to do that and how to help prepare student researchers to do that, as well as how we help practitioners engage with us as well. So I think there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think, you know, notwithstanding Jason's comment that, you know, the answer is what we're doing now. We have been doing a lot of work with research practice partnerships, and now both Chris and I are involved in a networked improvement community related to rural school leadership development. And I think those sorts of structures get you into the schools, and which I agree with Jason, we need to be doing a lot more of that. We need to be thinking about how to help them develop practice-based evidence rather than adopting evidence-based practices. And so they can get better at getting better, which is, you know, the focus of a lot of Tony Brick's work in improvement science. And I think that is an area that we really need to, and there has been an increase in involvement in. But I think that's important, whatever the topic it is whether it's social justice or whether it's another aspect of student well-being and learning. We need to develop a much tighter connection with the community, the practice community that we're trying to serve. So.
And how might researchers, I know this is probably a general question, but again, how how do we kind of, again, we have multiple pressures, different things. How can we bring together the research and practice? How can principals, again, are constrained with time, researchers, right? But how do we make that might that look like, or integrate into our everyday work?
Yeah.
So I think one thing that I think of is, actually, I know like Hans and Kristen have done this with some of the schools they've worked with, and I'm trying to get this up and running in Chicago, is having some sustained relationships with schools. So we're not, because if you're on the faculty and like you've got the publish or perish thing is real, right? You've got to get a certain amount of articles out and published to get tenure, and that can reward let me go in, get my data, and go out, and not engage in sharing back what I've learned from doing my research that could help this school improve, which then could further my research actually. So if we can develop sustained long-term relationships with schools, then I think we can begin to shift a little bit the relationship, but also we're actually going to then support schools in growing and leaders in those schools in growing. And then we're going to get better research because of that, because we're going to actually follow ideas a little bit more thoroughly than just let me go in and be able to write 2 articles and then move on to the next thing. So.
Yeah, and I think UCA has, provides some nice guidelines for programs in terms of evaluating how well their program is engaged with the constituents that they're involved in teaching and delivering the courses to. And one of the things we've tried to do, which I know isn't terribly innovative, but has been very helpful, is developing steering committees of districts where we are offering cohorts for our masters and at specialist programs and even doctoral programs. And so what we've been doing in these steering committees is sharing our ideas about the courses, but also getting feedback from representatives from each of the districts in terms of what's happening in those districts, what they like to see in the courses. So there's a good there's an opportunity for dialogue there about what's happening. We're getting a much better sense of what the district is looking for and what opportunities there are to partner with people in the district, for people to come in for how to tailor our assignments or think outside the box with program delivery. And the representatives from the districts have been big partners in that. So I think that's another direction we're going to continue to go, and I know other programs do the same as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the longer I'm in the professoriate, the more students I have actually in practice that I can, and be responsive to their needs. But when I'm actually I'm not familiar with a principal or not familiar with a leader, and I'm doing research there, or trying to move towards a research practice partnership, looking for reciprocity, so what does reciprocity look like in the research process? And so is that asking them what they need and then responding to it? And it may be from left field. The last educational leader I interviewed, she asked for a change model, which that would surprise me, but then I responded with giving her one of the CBAM, which is kind of a ubiquitous change model. And so I think it's just being responsive to the needs. They come up, and when you're responsive, then they want to engage with you more. And then that just continues to build that relationship and build that trust and those kinds of things. And so, I mean, it's kind of, leadership 101, build relationships and be responsive to the needs of the people that you really want to help and have that partnership with.
I think it's been a great conversation. I want to be respectful of your time, and we're just about up here, but I don't, do any of you have any final thoughts? Or I think this has been a very valuable conversation. I know the viewers are going to really enjoy looking at this and listening to hear. We touched on a lot of different things in a very short amount of time. This conversation could go on, but is there anything that you have to leave the viewers with and to say? All right. No, I would like to thank all three of you for your time and willingness to volunteer. I think it's really important. I know from my experience as a graduate student, and wanting to be a researcher in principal leadership, but how can school leaders better support teachers? You know, thinking about some of the barriers that might encounter, and then also using research. I think that the point on that was kind of the last point made about this collaboration with school district and with school leaders from a research perspective and the importance of that. So thank you all for your time again. I really appreciate it, and I'll let you go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you very much. All right. Be sure to tune in for our next session next month. Thank you.